The city of Acre, a bustling port on the northern coast of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, stood as one of the most strategically significant strongholds in the Holy Land during the late 12th century. Its value was not only commercial but military. Whoever controlled Acre effectively commanded the maritime supply routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Levant, enabling the movement of troops, provisions, and weaponry. For the Crusaders, who had been reeling from the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the subsequent capture of Jerusalem by Saladin, regaining a foothold on the coast was an urgent necessity. Acre was not merely another city, it was a gateway that could determine the fate of the Crusade and, symbolically, the fate of Christendom's ambitions in the Holy Land. By 1189, the Third Crusade was gathering momentum. European monarchs and nobles, motivated by a mixture of religious fervor, political ambition, and personal glory, were preparing to reclaim what had been lost to Muslim forces under the legendary leader Saladin. Among them, King Richard I of England, later immortalized as Richard the Lionheart, was beginning to assert his reputation as one of Europe's most formidable military leaders. But before the Crusaders could even contemplate the recapture of Jerusalem, they had to wrest control of Acre, which had been fortified and reinforced under Saladin's administration. The city's walls were high and thick, and its defenders were well supplied and determined to resist any attack. The Crusader army, a diverse and often fractious coalition of European knights, infantry, and mercenaries, arrived outside Acre in August 1189. The siege that followed would endure for nearly 2 years, becoming one of the longest and bloodiest confrontations of the Crusades. From the outset, it was clear that the siege would not be a simple matter of storming the walls or quickly forcing a surrender. Acre was heavily fortified, surrounded by massive walls and towers that had been designed to withstand prolonged attacks. The defenders had stockpiled supplies, and their morale remained high despite the knowledge that relief forces might not arrive. The Crusaders employed a range of siege techniques, combining brute force with cunning strategy. Massive wooden siege towers, covered in iron plates to resist fire, were rolled up against the city walls. Engineers dug tunnels in an attempt to undermine the foundations, hoping to collapse key sections of the fortifications. Trebuchets hurled enormous stones over the walls, and crossbowmen and archers sought to suppress the defenders' counterattacks. The fighting was relentless, with both sides suffering heavy casualties from disease, starvation, and the constant clash of arms. Yet despite their technological and numerical advantages, the Crusaders found themselves mired in a grueling stalemate. Each attempt to breach the walls was met with fierce resistance, often resulting in months of attritional combat with little to show for it. The human cost of the siege was staggering. For the soldiers, life outside the walls was grueling, scorching summer heat, biting winter cold, contaminated water, and limited rations. Disease, particularly dysentery and typhoid, spread rapidly through the Crusader camps. The civilian population of Acre, trapped inside the city, endured equally dire conditions. As the siege dragged on, famine became a reality. Chroniclers describe streets lined with corpses, the stench of decay, and families reduced to eating what little scraps they could find. The siege was not only a test of military might, but of sheer endurance, mental fortitude, and the limits of human resilience. Amid this chaos, the leadership of the Crusaders was crucial. Richard I, who would arrive at Acre later in 1191, distinguished himself early in the siege through a combination of tactical brilliance and unyielding determination. He understood that Acre was not merely a prize of war, but a key to the broader campaign of the Third Crusade. Control of the city would allow the Crusaders to establish a secure base of operations, replenish supplies, and rally further reinforcements from Europe. Yet leadership was also a delicate balancing act. The Crusader army consisted of men from multiple nations, each with their own leaders, ambitions, and rivalries. Coordinating attacks, maintaining morale, and enforcing discipline among a diverse coalition proved to be nearly as challenging as the battle itself. The prolonged nature of the siege also created opportunities for political maneuvering. Negotiations with the city's defenders, were initiated periodically, with proposals for surrender and ransom exchanged, yet trust was in short supply. Both sides were acutely aware that betrayal or broken promises could alter the course of the conflict. These delicate negotiations, often intertwined with threats and displays of force, added a layer of psychological warfare to the already intense physical struggle. The Siege of Acre was therefore as much a battle of wills as it was of weapons and fortifications. By late 1190, the siege had reached a critical juncture. Crusader reinforcements from Europe began to arrive, boosting the army's numbers and replenishing depleted supplies. Yet even with these reinforcements, the campaign remained arduous. Every day brought fresh skirmishes, ambushes, and casualties. Chroniclers recorded scenes of unimaginable suffering, men and horses succumbing to exhaustion, trenches filled with the bodies of the dead, and relentless attacks that tested the courage of even the most seasoned knights. Despite these horrors, the determination to capture Acre never wavered. The city had become a symbol. Its capture would demonstrate that the Crusaders could strike back after the catastrophic defeats of the previous decade and reclaim Christian dominance in the Holy Land. Ultimately, the Siege of Acre marked a pivotal turning point in the Third Crusade. It showcased the brutal realities of medieval warfare, where strategy, endurance, and sheer brutality were all intertwined. The events at Acre also foreshadowed the darker episodes to come, particularly the infamous massacre of prisoners that would forever stain Richard the Lionheart's reputation. While the siege itself was a military endeavor, it also highlighted the intersection of politics, religion, and human ambition that defined the Crusades. Acre was not simply a city to be conquered. It was a crucible in which the ambitions, virtues, and vices of leaders and soldiers alike were tested under fire. In the end, the Siege of Acre exemplified the ferocity and complexity of medieval warfare. It demonstrated how a single city could hold immense strategic, symbolic, and emotional weight for both attackers and defenders. As the Crusaders continued their relentless campaign, the siege stood as a testament to the stakes of the Third Crusade. Lives, faith, and the control of an entire region hung in the balance. For Richard the Lionheart and his contemporaries, Acre was more than a battlefield. It was the stage upon which the fate of a crusade and the legacy of a king would be forged. Richard I of England, better known to history as Richard the Lionheart, remains one of the most legendary figures of the medieval era, a king whose reputation as a warrior far outshone his role as a ruler. Born on September 8, 1157, in Oxford, England, Richard was the third son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, two of the most powerful figures in 12th century Europe. From an early age, Richard was immersed in the culture of chivalry, warfare, and leadership, honing the skills that would eventually define him as a military genius. While his youth was marked by political intrigue and familial conflicts, particularly the frequent rebellions against his father, Richard's prowess in battle and his charismatic presence among soldiers foreshadowed the role he would play during the Third Crusade. Richard's ascension to the English throne in 1189 came amid both triumph and tension. His father's reign had established a vast Angevin empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but governing such a sprawling territory was fraught with difficulty. Richard inherited not only a kingdom, but also the complex web of feudal allegiances, international rivalries, and internal dissent that his father had managed with varying degrees of success. Despite these responsibilities, Richard's primary focus remained on the Crusade, a military and religious expedition to reclaim Jerusalem, lost to Saladin's forces in 1187. For Richard, the Crusade represented not just a religious duty, but an opportunity to solidify his legacy, assert his authority across Christendom, and demonstrate the valor that had become synonymous with his name. From the outset, Richard demonstrated qualities that would distinguish him from many of his contemporaries. His leadership style was a combination of ruthlessness, charisma, and strategic intelligence. Unlike many medieval rulers who relied heavily on advisors or delegated command to subordinates, Richard frequently led from the front. He was known to personally participate in battles, often placing himself in the thickest fighting, inspiring his troops by example. His ability to command respect and loyalty, even from men of diverse nationalities and temperaments, made him an indispensable figure in the Crusader army. Knights, infantry, and mercenaries recognized his courage, understanding that a victory under Richard's command was more than a tactical win. It was a testament to his leadership and prestige. Richard's military brilliance was matched by his understanding of psychological warfare. He recognized that the reputation of a commander could be as powerful as any siege engine or sword. Tales of his fearlessness and martial skill circulated rapidly, instilling both hope among his allies and fear among his enemies. Chroniclers of the era recount episodes where Richard's mere presence on the battlefield was enough to sway morale, rallying his troops in moments of despair and intimidating opponents even before combat began. Such psychological dominance would play a key role during the Siege of Acre, where patience, endurance, and the ability to outmaneuver opponents were as crucial as raw strength. Yet Richard's character was not solely defined by battlefield heroics. He was a complex figure, capable of great political calculation, as well as cruelty when it served his objectives. He understood the intricacies of diplomacy, negotiating alliances with European monarchs, regional lords, and local powers in the Levant. These negotiations were often tense and fraught with competing interests. Philip II of France, for example, had his own ambitions in the crusade, and coordination among the Crusader leaders was frequently strained. Richard's ability to assert authority and maintain cohesion among a coalition army made him indispensable, but it also revealed a side of him that was uncompromising and at times harsh, willing to use extreme measures to achieve his goals. Religion was a driving force in Richard's life, though not always in a conventional sense. While he was a devout Christian and committed to the Crusader cause, his devotion was intertwined with personal ambition, honor, and reputation. The crusade offered him a platform to embody the ideals of chivalric knighthood, courage, loyalty, piety, and martial skill. However, his religious zeal did not preclude acts of extreme violence. Richard was known to make pragmatic, sometimes brutal decisions when circumstances demanded it, valuing strategic advantage over moral restraint. This combination of piety and pragmatism would come to define his actions at Acre, where the lines between honorable warfare and ruthless retribution blurred dramatically. Richard's relationship with his army also reveals much about the man behind the legend. Crusader forces were far from homogeneous. They consisted of soldiers from England, France, and other European states, as well as mercenaries with differing motivations. Maintaining unity among such a diverse army required more than charisma. It demanded decisive action and, at times, harsh discipline. Richard's ability to enforce order, reward valor, and punish insubordination ensured that the Crusader forces remained effective even under the strains of a prolonged siege. His presence was both inspiring and intimidating, fostering loyalty while suppressing dissent, a balance that few medieval leaders managed with such effectiveness. Despite his martial reputation, Richard was also acutely aware of the political stakes of his actions. Every victory, every negotiation, and even every act of cruelty was calculated to serve both immediate military objectives and long-term strategic goals. His decisions were guided by the understanding that perception mattered as much as reality. The reputation of the Crusaders in Europe, among their allies, and even among their enemies, could influence reinforcements, funding, and local support. Richard's combination of military skill, political acumen, and personal courage made him a figure whose actions would echo far beyond the battlefield, shaping the course of the crusade and leaving a lasting impression on history. In the context of the Siege of Acre, Richard's presence transformed the campaign. He arrived in 1191, having traveled overland with a portion of his army, and immediately took command of key operations. His strategic planning, personal bravery, and insistence on decisive action reinvigorated the Crusader forces, who had been fatigued by months of grueling siege warfare. Richard quickly demonstrated that he was willing to take bold and unorthodox measures to achieve victory, a quality that would soon manifest in both awe-inspiring and horrifying ways. Under his leadership, the Crusaders began to tighten their stranglehold on Acre, pressuring the defenders into negotiations while simultaneously preparing for the final assaults that would determine the fate of the city. Richard the Lionheart was more than a king. He was a symbol of medieval martial idealism. His life blended legend and reality, a tapestry of courage, cunning, devotion, and ruthlessness. At Acre, these traits were tested and revealed in their fullest measure. His ability to command, inspire, and at times terrify both allies and enemies would culminate in decisions whose consequences would resonate across Christendom and the Islamic world alike. The events that followed, particularly the infamous massacre of prisoners, cannot be fully understood without appreciating the man who orchestrated them. A warrior king whose ambition, ferocity, and indomitable will defined an era and shocked the medieval world. The city of Acre, perched on the northern coast of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was no ordinary medieval stronghold. By the time the Crusaders arrived in 1189, the city had been fortified for decades, serving as a critical defensive and commercial hub under successive rulers. Its walls were thick and tall, constructed of stone that had withstood countless assaults, while towers punctuated its perimeter at regular intervals, providing archers with vantage points to repel attackers. Beyond the walls, moats and rocky terrain created natural obstacles that hindered any siege engine or infantry advance. Within, the city was a hive of activity, with civilian populations, garrisons, and supply stores all coordinated to endure long periods of conflict. The defenders of Acre were not only prepared for battle, they were determined to resist to the last, understanding that surrender could mean death, slavery, or loss of honor. The leadership of Acre fell to a coalition of Muslim commanders loyal to Saladin. These men were seasoned warriors who understood the importance of the city as a military and symbolic prize. The commanders' strategy combined both conventional and unconventional tactics, reflecting centuries of experience in defending cities against invading armies. They relied on well-trained soldiers, fortified positions, and clever engineering to repel attacks. Gates were reinforced, walls repaired under cover of night, and sorties were launched to harass the besiegers. Defenders also employed psychological tactics, using the city's visibility from the coast to signal resilience and intimidate crusader forces. Flags and banners were displayed, morale-boosting ceremonies were held, and stories of previous victories were circulated to ensure the population and garrison remained resolute. The Crusaders arrived with their own formidable arsenal, but Acre's defenders were far from passive. The siege quickly devolved into a deadly stalemate. Every attack by the Crusaders was met with equally fierce resistance. Siege towers rolled up to the walls, only to be set ablaze or overturned by defenders. Trebuchets hurled massive stones, which defenders countered with fire arrows and collapsing barricades. Mining operations intended to undermine the walls were met with countermines and traps designed to collapse tunnels on the attackers. The defenders' knowledge of the city's geography gave them a significant advantage, allowing them to anticipate and frustrate many of the Crusaders' tactics. Both sides endured enormous hardship. For the Crusaders, months of siege warfare meant exposure to the elements, disease, and dwindling supplies. Dysentery, scurvy, and other illnesses ran rampant through the camps, weakening soldiers and decimating ranks. Horses and pack animals often starved or fell ill, undermining cavalry effectiveness. For the defenders inside Acre, the situation was equally dire. While they had stockpiled provisions in anticipation of a siege, food and clean water became increasingly scarce over time. Civilians suffered alongside soldiers, and famine loomed as the siege dragged on. Chroniclers described the harrowing scenes within the city, streets littered with the sick and dead, families forced to ration meager portions, and desperate attempts to secure food from dwindling stores or smuggling. The physical and psychological toll on both besiegers and defenders created a grim atmosphere where the will to fight was tested as much as the body. Despite the extreme conditions, Acre's defenders maintained remarkable discipline and cohesion. Saladin's appointed commanders implemented strict regulations, ensuring that soldiers rotated duties, defended key positions, and monitored the civilian population. Patrols were sent outside the walls to disrupt crusader camps, raids were conducted under cover of darkness, and any internal dissent was swiftly punished. The defenders' organization allowed them to survive where many besieged cities had fallen under less disciplined command. The ability to maintain morale in such dire circumstances was a testament to both the leadership and the cultural resolve of Acre's inhabitants. The stalemate at Acre was prolonged further by the political and military dynamics of the Crusader army. The Crusaders were not a unified force, they were a coalition of European powers, each with its own agendas, rivalries, and grievances. English, French, German, and Italian contingents operated under different commanders, and disagreements over strategy and spoils of war were common. This lack of cohesion initially hampered the Crusader effort, allowing the defenders to exploit delays and miscommunications. Richard the Lionheart's eventual arrival would begin to unify the Crusader forces, but even then, achieving total coordination among a multinational army remained a constant challenge. Negotiations during the stalemate became a critical component of the siege. Leaders on both sides recognized that military action alone could not secure victory quickly. Envoys were exchanged, messages sent, and proposals made for surrender, ransom, or safe passage. However, trust was scarce. Both Crusaders and defenders were aware that broken promises or betrayal could shift the balance of power dramatically. The defenders in particular used negotiations as a delaying tactic, buying time to reinforce defenses, repair damage, and await potential reinforcements from Saladin. These diplomatic maneuvers added another layer of complexity to the siege, turning it into a war of both strategy and patience. The city itself became a crucible of endurance, shaping the experiences and reputations of those involved. Chroniclers record the ingenuity and resourcefulness of Acre's defenders, cisterns dug to capture rainwater, hidden caches of food, and makeshift weapons fashioned from available materials. Even as the city's fortifications were battered, the defenders adapted, reinforcing weak points and constructing new defensive positions. Every assault by the Crusaders was met with resistance, every breach anticipated and countered. For the Crusaders, this relentless opposition was both frustrating and illuminating, revealing the defenders' tactical brilliance and the challenges of medieval siege warfare. Ultimately, the stalemate at Acre showcased the interplay of human endurance, military strategy, and political calculation. Neither side could claim a decisive advantage for months, and the siege evolved into a war of attrition. For the defenders, survival depended on discipline, ingenuity, and courage. For the Crusaders, victory required patience, coordination, and the leadership of figures like Richard the Lionheart, who could inspire troops, plan complex operations, and make ruthless decisions when necessary. By the time reinforcements arrived from Europe, the defenders of Acre had already demonstrated remarkable resilience, forcing the Crusaders to refine their tactics and approach the siege with renewed strategy. The prolonged conflict set the stage for the dramatic events that would soon unfold. The eventual surrender negotiations, the promises of ransom, and ultimately the infamous massacre of prisoners that would shock both Christendom and the Islamic world. The stalemate at Acre was not merely a military impasse. It was a test of wills, endurance, and the limits of medieval warfare, highlighting the determination of a city and its defenders against the mightiest forces Europe could muster. In the end, the defenders of Acre exemplified the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of those who understood that their city represented more than stone walls. It was a symbol of faith, survival, and honor in a world dominated by war. Their efforts would challenge the Crusaders, shape the decisions of kings, and leave a lasting mark on the history of the Third Crusade, proving that even the most formidable armies could be halted by strategic foresight, discipline, and unwavering resolve as the Siege of Acre dragged on into late 1190 and early 1191. Both the Crusaders and the defenders realized that military action alone would not determine the city's fate. Months of attritional combat had exhausted men and resources on both sides. Disease and famine were taking their toll, morale was waning, and the human cost of the stalemate was staggering. It was at this critical juncture that negotiations between the besiegers and the besieged took center stage, a complex and tense interplay of diplomacy, strategy, and psychology that would ultimately determine the outcome of the siege. The defenders of Acre, aware that their fortifications were strong but their supplies were finite, were willing to consider surrender under favorable conditions. Their primary concern was the safety of the city's inhabitants and the protection of their captured comrades. In particular, the defenders hoped to secure safe passage for the Muslim garrison and the release of prisoners in exchange for a ransom. For them, this was not only a tactical consideration but also a matter of honor. Surrender on mutually agreed terms could preserve dignity and save lives, whereas capitulation under force would mean humiliation and potential slaughter. Messages were sent to the Crusader commanders, offering negotiations under specific conditions. On the Crusader side, leaders understood the potential value of such an arrangement. Capturing Acre through negotiation, rather than continued bloody assaults, would save thousands of lives and allow the Crusaders to consolidate their position on the coast. It would also send a powerful message to the broader Christian world that the Crusaders were capable of achieving strategic victories through both diplomacy and force. However, agreeing to a negotiated surrender was not a simple decision. The Crusaders were a coalition army with competing leaders and national interests. Philip II of France, Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, although he died en route to the Crusade, and Richard I of England each had their own perspectives on strategy, reward, and the treatment of prisoners. Any agreement required delicate coordination and unanimous, or at least broadly acceptable, consent among these leaders. Richard the Lionheart, who arrived at Acre in the spring of 1191, quickly took a central role in these negotiations. Known for his sharp mind, strategic acumen, and reputation for both courage and ruthlessness, Richard understood that diplomacy could be as decisive as siege engines in bringing the city under Crusader control. He met with envoys from the Muslim defenders, listening to their proposals, evaluating their sincerity, and gauging the potential risks of any agreement. His approach was pragmatic. While he was committed to the Crusades' religious and military goals, he also recognized the importance of securing favorable terms that would strengthen his position and minimize further losses among his troops. Negotiations were protracted and fraught with tension. Both sides were aware that trust was a rare commodity in a conflict defined by decades of religious and political enmity. The Crusaders demanded the surrender of the city and its fortifications, as well as the release of Christian prisoners who had been captured during Saladin's campaigns. The defenders, in turn, sought to ensure the safety of their garrisons, civilians, and families, while offering monetary ransom as a form of compensation. These exchanges were complicated by the fact that both sides had factions with differing agendas. Some Crusader leaders pushed for an uncompromising approach, favoring the complete execution of prisoners or the sacking of the city to demonstrate strength. Others, including Richard initially, saw the potential advantages of a negotiated settlement that could be enforced with strict conditions and guarantees. The negotiations were not only about immediate survival, they also carried profound symbolic weight. For the defenders of Acre, surrendering to the Crusaders without guarantees could signal weakness to other cities in the region, potentially undermining Muslim resistance across the Levant. Conversely, for the Crusaders, achieving a peaceful surrender would bolster their reputation in Europe, demonstrating that Christian forces could assert authority without unnecessary slaughter. Both sides were acutely aware that the outcome of these negotiations would be scrutinized, not only on the battlefield but across continents, influencing morale, recruitment, and future political alliances. Despite these considerations, the negotiations were fragile and precarious. Each side suspected the other of bad faith, and intelligence or misinformation played a critical role. Envoys were closely watched, messages were encoded or delivered under secrecy, and both sides took precautions to prevent sabotage or betrayal. For the Crusaders, there was the added complexity of coordinating among a multinational army, each contingent with its own leaders, loyalties, and expectations. For the defenders, the pressure of dwindling supplies and the psychological strain of an extended siege made decision-making fraught with urgency, anxiety, and internal dissent. Eventually, after months of intense discussion, an agreement began to take shape. The Muslim defenders offered to release a substantial number of prisoners, including those captured in earlier battles such as the Battle of Hattin, in exchange for a monetary ransom and assurances of safe conduct. The Crusaders, seeing the strategic advantage of securing the city without further prolonged bloodshed, appeared willing to accept these terms. Preparations were made to transfer prisoners and negotiate the delivery of ransom payments. On paper, this arrangement promised a resolution that would satisfy both sides, avoid further loss of life, and allow the Crusaders to consolidate their control of Acre. However, beneath the veneer of diplomacy, tensions simmered. The Crusader leaders, especially Richard, were under intense pressure. Their troops were impatient, suffering from months of exposure, hunger, and disease. There was also a growing awareness that Saladin's forces might attempt to relieve Acre or retaliate if negotiations dragged on or appeared insincere. Richard and his commanders faced a critical decision: enforce the agreement as W.R. Itten, press for additional concessions, or take decisive action to secure the city definitively. The stakes were extraordinarily high, with political, military, and religious implications intertwining in a precarious balance. This precarious balance would ultimately be shattered by the events that followed, as the combination of mistrust, strategic calculation, and human desperation escalated into one of the most infamous incidents of the Crusades. The negotiations, which had held the promise of peaceful resolution, set the stage for the controversial decisions that would shock both Europe and the Islamic world. They highlight the complexity of medieval diplomacy in wartime, where promises, honor, and survival were constantly tested against the harsh realities of siege warfare, factional politics, and the brutal logic of medieval conflict. In retrospect, the negotiations at Acre illustrate the duality of Richard the Lionheart's leadership. His capacity for strategic foresight, his understanding of diplomacy, and his willingness to engage with adversaries contrasted sharply with his readiness to employ extreme measures when circumstances demanded. The promise of ransom and the tentative agreements reached with the defenders reflect the delicate dance of medieval diplomacy, a process in which human lives were bargaining chips, and the line between negotiation and violence was perilously thin. Ultimately, the negotiations and the promise of ransom were more than a prelude to the capture of Acre. They were a window into the turbulent world of the Crusades, where strategy, honor, survival, and brutality coexisted in a volatile mix. The stage was set, the defenders had made their offers, the Crusaders had positioned themselves for victory, and Richard the Lionheart's next decisions would determine the fate of thousands, solidify his legend, and leave an indelible mark on history. The Siege of Acre, which had stretched over nearly 2 grueling years, reached its climactic and most infamous moment in July 1191, when Richard the Lionheart made a decision that would reverberate across the medieval world. What began as a protracted military campaign and delicate negotiation with the city's defenders culminated in an act of unparalleled brutality: the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners. This event, known in history as the Massacre at Acre, shocked contemporaries on both sides of the conflict and became one of the most controversial episodes of the Third Crusade. The lead-up to the massacre was rooted in a combination of mistrust, frustration, and strategic calculation. By the summer of 1191, Acre had finally capitulated under terms negotiated between the Crusaders and the Muslim garrison. The defenders, desperate to save themselves and the city's civilians, agreed to surrender in exchange for a ransom and the promise of safe passage. For the Crusaders, the agreement was supposed to mark the end of a protracted siege, allowing them to secure the city, consolidate supplies, and prepare for the next phase of the campaign toward Jerusalem. On paper, it was a diplomatic victory, one that had the potential to be executed without further bloodshed. However, the execution of the agreement quickly became fraught. The Muslim defenders had promised to deliver the agreed ransom, but delays and logistical challenges created suspicion among the crusaders. Richard, renowned for his intelligence, martial skill, and sometimes ruthless decisiveness, interpreted the delays as deceit or outright bad faith. His forces, exhausted by years of siege warfare and desperate for resolution, were growing increasingly restless. The combination of impatience, frustration, and the need to assert authority over both allies and enemies created a volatile environment in which extreme measures became thinkable. Richard's decision to execute the prisoners must be understood in the context of the brutal realities of medieval warfare. In the 12th century, siege warfare as not only a test of military might, but a psychological battle designed to intimidate, demoralize, and enforce compliance. By eliminating the prisoners, Richard sent a stark message. Resistance to the Crusaders would be met with overwhelming and uncompromising force. The act was intended to consolidate his power, discourage future resistance, and demonstrate to both allies and enemies that the Crusader leadership would not tolerate deception or delay. Yet, while strategically rational from Richard's perspective, the massacre was morally shocking even to contemporaries. Accounts from chroniclers of both Christian and Muslim backgrounds highlight the horror, describing a mass slaughter that left men, women, and children dead in its wake. The method of execution, though grim, reflected the practical realities of medieval military logistics. The prisoners, numbering in the thousands, were gathered in groups and dispatched in a manner intended to maintain order and prevent chaos. Contemporary chroniclers describe mass beheadings and executions by sword, with soldiers forced to carry out the orders under Richard's supervision. The scale of the slaughter was staggering, and the psychological impact on both the Crusaders and the surviving population of Acre was profound. While the Crusader army might have perceived the massacre as a necessary action to assert dominance, it also left an indelible stain on Richard's reputation, a king celebrated for bravery yet condemned for extreme cruelty. The massacre also had immediate military and political consequences. In the short term, it secured Acre for the Crusaders and eliminated a large number of potential combatants who might have opposed them in the next stages of the campaign. However, it also inflamed Muslim resistance, strengthening Saladin's resolve and intensifying the animosity between the two sides. Reports of the massacre spread rapidly across the Levant, serving as both a warning and a rallying cry for future engagements. Muslim chroniclers emphasized the scale and brutality of the act, portraying Richard not as a noble Christian warrior but as a merciless aggressor. Meanwhile, in Europe, reactions were mixed. Some praised his decisiveness and military genius, while others criticized the apparent disregard for the ethical and religious norms that governed warfare at the time. The massacre at Acre highlights the complex interplay of morality, strategy, and psychology in medieval warfare. It illustrates the extreme pressures faced by commanders during protracted sieges, where trust was fragile, supplies were limited, and the stakes included not only territory but the lives of thousands. Richard's choice to execute the prisoners was a calculated decision, intended to assert control, enforce compliance, and demonstrate his uncompromising approach to leadership. Yet it also reflected the darker realities of the Crusades, where acts of mass violence were sometimes seen as tools of statecraft and instruments of psychological warfare. Furthermore, the event exposed the tension between personal reputation and ethical conduct. Richard's image as a heroic chivalric king was juxtaposed with his capacity for ruthless violence. In the eyes of his soldiers, he embodied courage, intelligence, and decisiveness. In the eyes of his enemies, and many historians, he represented the capacity for cold-blooded cruelty, willing to sacrifice moral considerations for strategic advantage. The massacre at Acre became a defining episode in his career, shaping how contemporaries and later generations would perceive his leadership. It served as a stark reminder that medieval kingship demanded both strategic genius and the capacity to make morally complex, often horrifying decisions. The massacre also underscores the role of human emotion in the conduct of war. Anger, frustration, and a desire for vengeance can profoundly influence strategic decisions, particularly in situations where prolonged conflict has created tension, fear, and uncertainty. Richard's actions at Acre were not solely the product of rational calculation. They were also fueled by the psychological pressures of leadership in extreme conditions. The long siege, repeated delays in ransom payment, and the demands of maintaining discipline among thousands of soldiers all contributed to a situation in which extreme measures became thinkable. The massacre at Acre, therefore, can be seen as both a military strategy and a response to the emotional and psychological strain of prolonged warfare. In the long term, the massacre shaped the narrative of the Third Crusade. It solidified Richard's reputation as a formidable warrior and commander, but also created enduring controversy over the ethics of his leadership. Muslim resistance to the Crusaders hardened, ensuring that future campaigns would be fought under the shadow of vengeance and mistrust. European chroniclers grappled with the tension between celebrating Richard's heroism and condemning his cruelty, resulting in a complex legacy that would endure for centuries. The massacre at Acre thus became emblematic of the brutal realities of the Crusades, a period in which religious fervor, strategic necessity, and human ambition intersected to produce acts of extraordinary violence. Ultimately, the massacre at Acre serves as a window into the harsh and often morally ambiguous world of medieval warfare. It illustrates the challenges of leadership, the pressures of protracted conflict, and the intersection of strategy, psychology, and morality. Richard the Lionheart's decision to execute 2,700 prisoners was shocking even by the standards of the time, yet it reflected the complex realities of a king operating in a brutal and unforgiving theater of war. The massacre left an indelible mark on history, shaping perceptions of the Crusades, influencing subsequent military conduct, and cementing Richard's legacy as a warrior whose courage and strategic genius were inseparable from his capacity for ruthless, shocking action. The events at Acre stand as a sobering reminder of the human cost of war. Thousands of lives were extinguished in a single decisive moment, demonstrating how political, military, and psychological imperatives can converge in acts of extreme violence. For historians, chroniclers, and modern readers, the massacre at Acre represents both a cautionary tale and a key to understanding the complex dynamics of leadership, strategy, and morality during the Crusades. In the end, it was not merely a battle or a siege that defined this moment. It was the chilling, calculated decision of a king whose actions would echo across centuries, shocking the medieval world and leaving a legacy both heroic and horrific.